Jay, we're back again with another episode. Thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. Jay, this episode is a Dig in Your Scene brought to you by our Patreon folks who voted for it. It was Washington, D.C. versus Athens, Georgia. The votes were heavy, but Athens came out ahead. And this one's been on the slate really for the entire time we've been doing this series, Jay.
Yeah.
It's kind of, it was this. We knew we wanted to do this. We knew we wanted to do Boston because so much interesting stuff happened in Boston in the 80s and 90s. And we're finally getting around to it. And
we haven't done in the spirit of the podcast, we have not done the obvious ones first. We did not do Seattle.
We're not doing
Seattle. Do Athens yet until today.
No. Well, and we haven't done Chapel Hill yet. That's another one where people were probably thinking, when are you dopes going to get to Chapel Hill? It's kind of important. We'll get there.
We did Australia.
We did the entire country of Australia, which in retrospect was kind of dismissive of the individual cities in Australia.
It's like, oh, one country. It's all the same.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't think that's going to fly for Great Britain.
I know.
I don't think that's going to work. Right. We'll just go our European episode. We won't even break it down by country. Let's cover Europe in the 80s. What happened?
Right.
So joining us, of course, we don't know anything about these cities when we, get into them. We have to bring on the people who lived it, the people who have written about it, the people who have experienced it firsthand. And to do so, joining us, I don't know where they are. They're somewhere in the country. We're all at home because of, what's going on. But joining us, author Grace Elizabeth Hale of the book Cool Town: How Athens, Georgia Launched Alternative Music and Changed American Culture. Welcome, Grace.
Thanks for having me. And I'm in Virginia, Charlottesville, Virginia.
Virginia. Okay. That's right, because you are a teacher, or you are at the University of Virginia. What do you do there?
I am a professor of American Studies and History. So I teach U.S. cultural history, history of popular music, things like that.
Oh, so this is perfect then. This is right up the alley. Excellent.
Yes.
And then also joining us, of course, if we're going to talk about a scene, we always do try to have someone who was a musician in that scene, so they can tell us like who had the worst bathroom or load-in situation behind the bar. Like those things are important to know. Which ones? Where did you get the stamps for the free beers? That kind of stuff. Those are the important things to bands when you're starting out. So joining us from the band Love Tractor, Mark Cline. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, guys. It's great to be with you all. Hey, Grace.
Hi, Mark.
And there's Love Tractor news. As we were putting this episode together, there was an announcement, right, Mark?
Yes, we are in the midst of re-releasing all of our catalog on vinyl because it hasn't been available on vinyl for a million years. And the first re-release is happening this fall. There's going to be a single for Record Store Day with some specially mixed songs that we worked on with Dave Barbie, who played in Sugar and a number of Athens bands, has kind of the go-to studio in Athens. And then one of our former members, Bill Berry, who went on to be a member of R.E.M., he shepherded the mixes as well. And so for Record Store Days, those mixes are coming out. And then the album has sort of been, in a sense, reimagined. The art has been expanded, and we had to actually remix the entire album because the quarter-inch masters were damaged. And so, but we kept the integrity of the original sound. So it's exciting. We have all these records coming out again, and they sound fresh and they sound great.
And you're talking about the 1982 self-titled debut, right? With regards to those masters?
That's right. The eponymous. We went back and, when we were getting all the archives together, we discovered that the quarter inch, that songs had been spliced out from the main master reel from the quarter inch and shipped off from different soundtracks or compilations or things like that, and just hadn't been archived properly. So there were songs missing. And rather than using, there were safeties of all of the songs, but safeties are a little bit lower fidelity. So rather than using the safeties and splicing those in, or the other option was just going and remixing those 5 missing songs, we said, well, for the fidelity and the integrity of the fidelity, let's just go and mix the whole thing again. And, you know, we had copious notes from when we'd mixed it back in the day. And Dave and Bill were very familiar with the engineer who had recorded and mixed it. And so it was fun going back through it and really keeping the integrity of it. It doesn't sound different. It just sounds better, just fuller. So there are no surprises there. But it was nice to hear it. It sounds very fresh.
Fantastic news, Mark. That's really great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Fun. It's fun.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We just finished one of the videos, and you know, we've got liner notes from Kate Pearson of the B-52s, Mike Mills from R.E.M. as liner notes, Anthony DeCurtis, the former editor of Rolling Stone, has done liner notes for it. So it's fun. It's fun. And you know, it's nice to be able to release something these days, especially in the digital world, because it's the music industry is very flat when it comes to digital. There's no concept of past or present. So,
right.
You know, I hope people listen to it with fresh ears.
Well, that's sort of the motto of the entire podcast, is digging up. When we do album reviews, a lot of the albums have just disappeared from the consciousness of most people, and a lot of times they're brand new to people. So even though something was released in 1994, it's a brand new record for people. So that's right up our alley in terms of discovering new music. And I'm curious because, you know, I'm assuming that was probably recorded in 81 or 80 or something like that. Were there any concerns about actually tracking down and, you know, I'm assuming that was on tape as well, which can deteriorate, I'm guessing, over the years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Everything was archived.
Okay.
But not superbly. But what was interesting, it actually took us a long time to unarchive and to get the digital transfers done, because the people we were using to do the digital transfers were hired to do like the first 14 years of Austin City Limits, and they were having a special tape head made just to do those transfers. And so we wanted to use them and that special tape head for the fidelity. And
Gotcha.
It took about 8 months for that tape head to be hand crafted. And then we were the first ones to be able to use that head to do our transfers. And so, you know, this would have all happened a year ago, except we were waiting for this tape head. And we'd be talking about the re-release right now of our second album instead of our first. But it's all exciting. It's fun. It's fun to revisit all of this.
Well, let's do that. Let's do some revisiting of the scene from your perspective and from Grace's perspective. Now, Grace, have you spent time previously in Athens? What was your connection to it?
I went to University of Georgia and lived there for years, and I actually played in a band, and not an important one like Love Tractor like Mark, so I'm really thrilled that he's here with us. But and I also ran a small club, so I lived there for a decade in the 80s.
Oh, okay, cool.
90s. Yeah.
So from a perspective of being in a band in that period and playing in the area, you mentioned about also, you know, the club. Where would you go to see bands? I know the 40 Watt is sort of the legendary, or one of them. But where would, you know, not necessarily a big band, but where would small bands be playing, cutting their teeth in the 80s and even into the 90s in the Athens scene?
At somebody's house.
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on when you're talking about in the 80s. I mean, if you're talking about the early 80s, somebody's house. By the later 80s, there are there are small places people can play, but it changes over the course of that decade.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, when I came to Athens, and I started in the fall of 1977, Athens was a ghost town. There was nothing there. There was the art school, and the art school was sort of a cultural nexus of sorts. But there were, it was a real rah football town, and that was the big drawing point. Other than that, it was a cultural wasteland, and I would still consider football to be a cultural wasteland. And the only thing that was really happening at the art school. And what was interesting at the time was the fact that, especially for the professors that were involved, most of them had been abstract expressionists, and that had fallen out of favor. So many of these abstract expressionists were looking for gigs and had been hired up by, universities. And so their teaching methods were something that really shook us to our core as students. And the art school of the University of Georgia became this club of sorts that all the bands basically came out of, at least my generation of bands, either were influenced by people in the art school or came out of the art school. There were no clubs in Athens whatsoever, except for the fraternity kids. And if these art students went to those clubs, we would get beaten up. We would, for sure get beaten up. And so the culture there was completely house parties, and it was people, I always say it was us and them, us being the art students and sort of these musicians, taking over houses, having parties in these houses, and then saying, spinning records is not enough. There's some instruments laying around. People would start playing, or they would form a little band to play. And out of that came the B-52s, Love Tractor, Pylon, R.E.M, that's sort of the classic school of that. And then the clubs developed after that. I mean, the 40-Watt Club, the famous one, was originated in Curtis Crowe Pylon's loft, because downtown Athens was desolate. It was empty. At nighttime, it was, you'd see tumbleweeds basically blowing down the street. Now, if you go there today, you can't get a parking place. There's parking garages and whatnot. So we could rent the top floors of these buildings in downtown Athens for, pennies. And Curtis from Pylon had the top floor of a building on College Avenue, right across from the university, huge loft space that was lit by a 40-watt bulb. And it's no joke. And he had keg parties there for all of us. And like Pylon, that was the first time that they played, was in his loft. And it would move to other people's houses, or the backyards. That, another one was, we all shared a house. I shared a house with Michael and Curtis from Pylon, and on a really kind of big street in Athens where all the bands lived, called Barber Street, and the house was dubbed Pylon Park. And in the back of the house, we had so much acreage that, bands would set up and just play. And the police could never figure out where the noise was coming from, so that they could never come around to shut us down.
Isn't that where Love Tractor debuted? Didn't you guys debut in the house there, Pylon Park?
Yeah. Yep, we did, in fact. We did. I was talking to a beer company the other day, because they've named the beer Love Tractor, and they were saying, and they wanted to know about when we started and all this. I said, well, actually, the first time we played was in this house on Barber Street, and Sam Seawright also lived in the house, and he made beer. He brewed beer for the party, which, Vanessa from Pylon was drinking out. No, David Gamble from the Method Actors was drinking the beer out of Vanessa from Pylon's high heel shoes. It was, it's a typical Athens sort of insane experience of that same crowd of people. That was 100 to 150 of us at the time, that we all knew each other. We're all still best friends, that sort of did all this together, made art together, supported each other. We played in bands together. But it's really important that the foundation was that there was nothing going on there. We were outsiders, so we had to find our own fun. We found each other, and we made our own fun, and we invented what we had to do it. And we were egged on by the professors at the art school. and then it became an industry.
I mean, you know, just to add to that, I mean, other early places people played, and Mark certainly jump in here, above Chapter 3 Records downtown, which is another one of these downtown spaces. There'd be concerts there. I don't know if Love Tractor played there, but I know Pylon played there. And
yeah, the Cramps played there. It was, you know, that was Chapter 3 rented that building, and they just had the upstairs was empty. Yeah. And okay, I think they threw at maximum 3 parties in there. One was Pylon. One was the Cramps. The Cramps were supposed to play the Georgia Theater, and I don't know what happened. The Georgia Theater maybe got spooked.
I can tell you what happened because Chris Rasmussen told me. I can tell you exactly what happened.
Chris would know because he ran the record store. Yeah.
They didn't sell enough tickets, and wasn't Pylon playing first? Whoever the first band was started to play. No one was there, and the club said they said no, forget it, shut it down. This is going to lose money. And so that's when they moved the show on the fly. They were like, they scrounged around, and I forget whose PA they got. I know Chris told me whose PA, but I've forgotten. And set it up at Chapter 3.
Yeah, and it was just a big loft space with, you know, set it up. There was no stage. It was an insane night. I remember Peter Buck and I, before the show, we were down in the record store, and like, I can even remember the records that they were spinning downstairs before we went upstairs for the Cramps to play. But, you know, Pylon played. Everyone, it was one of those nights where everyone just got zonked out of their minds. But like Lux Interiors was hanging out outside the window on the second floor. He's leaning backwards outside of the window singing songs so he could have fallen out of the window. It was one of these crazy nights that would only happen in Athens. But you have to also understand that it was sort of like going into the middle of nowhere, because Athens was the middle of nowhere at the time. And there's the Cramps playing, you know, in the empty top floor of a building in the middle of nowhere, like some town, and you could point on the map and pick a town, and that's what was going on. And it was crazy, you know, it was crazy. The Cramps, John Cale, the people that would come through. And then, you know, it became sort of Curtis had his loft, and he called it 40 Watt Club. And then with a friend, Bill Tabor, they sort of got smart and said, well, let's move it across the street, which was next door to the record store the Chapter 3, upstairs. And this place already had a beer license downstairs. It was a sandwich shop. And so that they could sort of tag on to that beer license. And that's where the 40 Watt started, you know, this little space just for all of us to come and start bands and play in there, and expanded from there. And downtown was a safe space because there was nothing there. Nothing.
Many people told me that prostitutes were there downtown at that time. I didn't move to town until 1982, but there were prostitutes, male and female prostitutes.
Yeah, there were up by the Georgian Hotel, and then by Hot Corner.
Yeah.
Where the prostitutes were. And it was crazy. It was just very, very different. And you know, everything was at the daytime. You know, it was all these like men's clothing stores, you know, really old school, you know, shoe stores. And this is before they built a mall. And at night it was desolate, absolutely desolate. And so we took it over, because all the other kids were partying at these like big beer halls and that were not near downtown. And maybe some of them were down by the railroad tracks, but a lot of them were on Baxter Street and, you know, that. But we didn't want to have anything to do with those people. So
interesting.
I mean,
it was all out.
The other early venue that was started, I think they started hosting these kind of bands. I mean, at the time they would have called it New Wave Night, but not that term really fits. But it was Tyrone's OC. Was that like 79 when they started hosting?
Yeah, it was Tyrone's, but there weren't any really there weren't any bands like, Pylon would play there maybe. It was still kind of a hippie joint,
Yeah.
Tyrone.
Yeah.
And so it'd be like these, but then they realized that they're these local bands and they realized they could fill the house with it. And the cover charge would be $1, which was hilarious. It was $1 to get in. And then Tyrone's burned down. But yeah, Tyrone sort of wised up and started doing that. And it was really fun. And it was a great place. And that was the first other place to really start doing it. And other than that, our big thing was when we started out, there was, a place in Athens to play, like the 40 watt. I think by the time the 40 watt really got revved up, Tyrone's had burned down, but we'd all played Tyrone. There's the 688 Club in Atlanta, and that was it. There was 930 in DC, the 930 Club, or New York. And there was really nothing in between until R.E.M. came along and sort of blazed the trail of discovering all these different venues in the Carolinas. And that opened up a whole other thing. They went and just sort of like bounced out, a 50-mile radius further, another 50-mile, another 100-mile radius, finding all these different venues. Whereas for us in Pylon, it was basically Atlanta, DC, New York, anything in between. Before R.E.M. had sort of broken that ground, we would get beer cans and beer bottles thrown at us, and because we were just too out there for a lot of those places.
That was that famous piece in New York Rocker that said Athens, 19 hours to New York.
Right.
So people would say Pylon's commuting to New York. They'd play maybe DC, but maybe just go straight to New York.
It's true. Philadelphia was another place. But it was always like DC, Philadelphia, sometimes New York. And there were weekends that we would all get in the cars and drive. I remember like R.E.M. and Love Tractor playing at Danceteria or someplace early on.
You played at Danceteria because I found the ad. You're right. It was Danceteria.
Getting in cars and driving up. Like, this is like on the weekend from, or skipping school on Friday or Monday or something like that. And we'd all drive up and play Danceteria and go to Dojo on St. Mark's and eat and whatnot. But there was nothing in between. And then R.E.M. discovered all the places in between. But they had a much more commercial appealing sound than Love Tractor or Pylon. We were also, we were kind of the art bands. R.E.M. was much more palatable, but then they made it easier for us because they made us palatable.
Do you think that the isolation of the city made as you say, the art bands it gave them an opportunity to develop longer, as opposed to when we've talked about Los Angeles or New York City, those bands almost have to like hit the ground running because of the fact that it's expensive to live there and you have to, it's pay to play to get into some of those clubs, especially in the 90s when it gets very competitive and there's lots of alternative bands, vying to get onto 7 or 8 band bills on a Tuesday. And it seems like when we've talked to folks who are from college towns like a Boston or even where I'm at in Columbus, Ohio, the isolation from, being hours away from a huge city and being driven by a college campus lends itself to letting bands like explore a little bit more and be a little bit more less commercially focused, I guess, and not trying to think about how do we get signed to a major, that sort of thing. Did you guys feel that?
Perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. There was no pressure. In fact, for us, and I know the same with Pylon, I can speak for them, our goals were very simple and also very similar. You know, we were all art students, and we were applying what we were learning in art school to these visual aesthetics, to oral aesthetics or performance. Because also, you know, we lived in a place that there was no commercial pressure whatsoever, so we could do whatever the hell we wanted to do. And I can just acknowledge that you hit the nail on the head. So.
I would add, though, also that the 80s are just really different from the 90s. I mean, it's not in any way to say that what Mark is saying isn't true, but it's just a very different world. I mean, people are inventing the music that will come to be called alternative and indie. I mean, some people are using the term new wave early on, then they're calling it post-punk. Then actually, a lot of people are just calling it the new music. And it doesn't really exist as a coherent commercialized thing yet. And so there's just a lot less pressure for these 80s bands everywhere. I mean, it's just such a different time period by the time you get to the 90s, especially post Nirvana. I mean, there is just so much more commercial pressure. I mean, people in Athens and other places like Athens are able to make fairly decent money playing local clubs in the 80s in ways that are not going to be imaginable in the 90s. So I think that, just to add to what Mark is saying,
Right.
And across the 80s in Athens, you always have a kind of hierarchy of clubs. You have, you know, the 40 watt for a long time at the top, although it goes through different spaces, and sometimes they're larger and sometimes they're smaller, and there's ups and downs. But there are always other clubs. The Uptown Lounge is a important club in the mid 80s for a stretch there, until the guy that owns it, Kyle, buys the Georgia Theater, which then is turned back into a music club. But there are always smaller venues as well, where new bands can get started and just play for the door. And the place may only hold 50 people, but if they're paying a couple of dollars a piece, you're getting a pretty good bit of money, and beers at a discount. And, you know, you can actually get started there and prove yourself, and then get a gig at a little bit bigger place. Maybe like the Uptown or the 40 watt. And so there is a kind of way in which people's friends will go hear them play at least once, even if they hate them, or twice. And so people can actually have this space to develop and even make a little bit of money to buy a little bit of equipment, or you know, pay some of your rent, what have you. So it is just a very different vibe, not just in Athens, but across these smaller scenes, especially in this earlier period.
I would even go so far as to say it was the same way in New York. That, you know, you could live in New York City in the East Village in the 80s and pay nothing in rent, or you could be squatting. And that's one of the reasons that New York had such a great art scene in the 80s, and also so many great bands came out of New York. I live in New York now, and we, you know, just the simple fact that when we were, the only places that we could play, as I said prior, were these other cities like New York. And we would come, and we knew all the other New York bands, and they were in the same circumstance. The fact that they could rent a practice space downtown, you know, in Alphabet City, and they could maybe go rehearse in the day, or if they were, you know, they would have to be out of there before nightfall because they might get killed. But it was incredibly inexpensive, and it was the same thing in New York, same thing in Athens. And there was also this odd connection, at least in my day, between New York and Athens, between New York musicians, photographers, artists, and Athens musicians, photographers, and artists, that there was a lot of back and forth from that, which, you know, Grace, you and I could talk about, like Jeremy Ayers and his involvement in the factory. And that sort of brought New York to Athens. There was a musician, artist, really artist, an artist of lifestyle named Jeremy Ayers, who was the godfather to a lot of us in Athens. And he, in the early 70s, had moved to New York and was involved in Warhol's factory. And he had a character named Sylvathan, and was in a number of movies with Candy Darling and some of the other superstars. And he came back to Athens, I think, in maybe 75. And when he came back, he sort of brought a lot of New York City with him. And he also left an opening for a lot of us in New York City. So, you know, when the B-52s first went to go play New York City, they had entree to a New York that they would not have had entree to if it had not been for Jeremy having lived there and knowing all of the right sort of in-crowd people. And I mean, just the simple fact that by the fall of my freshman year in 1977 in Athens, I already knew Chris and Tina from the Talking Heads. And that was just by the fact of being in Athens and that sort of Athens, New York connection. You know, it was very tight, but you know, one of my good friends, Dana, her boyfriend was John Cale. So, you know, we had this other entree into things, and we could come back to Athens and do whatever we wanted because there was no commercial concern that we had to make money off of what we were doing. It was great. It was an added bonus, but there was no industry to music in Athens. In fact, we noticed when it changed, I think one of the first people that moved to Athens to sort of further their career was Matthew Sweet, who, you know, brilliantly moved from Nebraska to Athens, befriended all of us, and we all befriended him because he's such a smart kid. And he was a kid at the time.
Yeah, 18.
Yeah. And, but he was the first person really to move to Athens to move there as a career move with ambition of being a musician. And he moved there and got a deal with, maybe it was Columbia, through Steve Robalski, who was his A&R person, basically paid him to live in Athens and write songs. And he was the first person. And then we would all go off on tour. The band would start doing records. We'd go off on tour and we'd come back and there'd be some more people that had moved there because of that. And this industry started to develop. I mean, and if you go now, it's an industry town. It's like another Nashville in a sense. There's publishing companies there, there are record companies there, there's tons of recording studios. And when we lived there was none of that. And we would have to go to Atlanta. That would be the closest place. If we needed to buy musical instruments or do any kind of recording, meet with a lawyer, we would have to leave Athens for all of that. And which was a plus because we were left alone to do whatever we wanted to do, especially artistically, which was really key to all of us.
I just wanted to say a bit more about Jeremy Ayers because he was so influential on Keith Strickland and Ricky Wilson and the B-52s. They were all friends growing up together in Athens high school. He was older, and he was a real mentor to them. And they came up to New York City to visit him when he was part of Warhol's factory, and that was a really a really important moment for them. And they decided, especially Ricky, that they wanted to bring some of that kind of magic back to Athens. So there is a way in which there is a kind of direct linkage and a very conscious attempt on the part of Ricky to spur that kind of creativity that he saw in the factory environs during the time when Warhol was hanging out with all the drag queens. Bring
100%. 100%. I mean, it also, I'd have to say, it can't be stressed enough what a musical genius Ricky Wilson was. That just absolutely brilliant. And that they really did bring that back to Athens, this aesthetic that they brought back. I mean, to me, it's sort of ironic now. It's like my business partner here in New York, we have an ad agency, was Andy Warhol's creative director from the mid 70s until when Andy died. And so he was involved in the factory. It's like, I can't escape it. It's like from Jeremy Ayers now to my business life is still tied up somehow with Andy Warhol.
I mean, Ricky, I think, is a really just an amazing person that hasn't, there's a way in which the B-52s as a whole, I don't think, have gotten taken serious. They're popular, but they're not taken seriously enough, at least it seems to me. And Ricky in particular. But Ricky was out in high school in Athens in 1970. And just to give you the historical context, that's the same year they integrated the schools and shut down the black high school, 1970. And he was out. So, and wow. Jeremy was a real mentor on that front too. He was connected to a group of older gay men and women connected a lot to the university, also to the art school. Some of them were professors, some were students, grad students. There was a vibrant, somewhat closeted, would you say, Mark, gay community in Athens, and Jerry was connected to it, and also Ricky and Keith.
Well, when I got there,
you were never closeted. You were not.
I was never closeted. Keith and Ricky were never closeted.
Right. Some of the people in this community were.
Some were, very much so, and some still are.
Yeah.
And
that's why I'm not naming names.
I will if I have a drink or two. But that also is a really important thing. Grace and I discussed is that there's this sort of aesthetic that came from the gay community that permeated the atmosphere of the music that was being created, because a lot of these creators, myself included, were gay. And Michael from R.E.M, it's virtually everyone in the B-52s except for Cindy. It was very much this gay aesthetic that was happening there, that really flavored what was coming out of Athens also, that made it even more apart and more separate than other places. Than, say, if you do something on Chapel Hill, that wasn't a part of their sort of overriding aesthetic. But
yeah, I think that's one of the things that gets left out of the story too much, just because of R.E.M's centrality and the fact that Michael was not open about his sexuality, at least not in a kind of super public way. In those early years, that people don't understand just how queer and how gay the scene is in Athens, and that creates a lot of space for different kinds of aesthetics, different musicians. It creates a lot of space for women, frankly. It's not just the guys that were the straight nerdy guys noodling on their guitars all through high school in their bedrooms. There's a lot of different, those folks are there, but there's other kinds of people too, very much in the scene. And the early B-52s is really in many ways modeled on those kinds of burlesque and dramatic performances. It's almost a kind of performance art as much as it is music. I'm not taking away from the music by saying that, but in the early days, that's a lot of what the B-52s were doing. So all of that is very important to the Athens scene and stays there, despite the fact that R.E.M sort of first becomes famous as the four guys, traditional rock band structure. People don't necessarily know that Michael is not straight. And I think people have that vision of Athens, but that's missing a lot.
Yeah, I think, queer is the best way to describe it. And also feminist. Women played such a huge role in the development of everything in Athens. And everybody that I was involved with, they were either queer, a lot of straight, they were also feminists. That all those sort of boundaries, these artists that were women that were the supporters of a lot of the bands, that Carol Levy, the photographer, Sandy Phipps, people that helped manage these bands. There was a feminist ethos also that hasn't been talked about, I don't think, that was there. But simply because of the group of people, again, were outsiders, outliers, and they they found themselves. And even to go back to what Grace is saying, it can't be stressed enough that the B-52s, what they were doing, people know them as like for Love Shack and these funny lyrics and things like that. But as a musician, when you look at what they were doing structurally, it's brilliant. It's as brilliant as Led Zeppelin or the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or Roy Orbison. They were doing these amazing things musically, and especially the influences they were pulling from were so out there. From Fellini, from Yoko Ono. I would go over to Jeremy Ayres' house, and he would have recordings of people playing, these early electronic instruments from the 1920s, the Ondes Martenot. And it just so much happening intellectually. And much more intellectually so than just say this wild, crazy party scene that everyone was taking drugs. Sure, that existed, but there was this complete intellectual side. You know, there was racism was not something that was, I mean, there was, I can remember being shocked being in Athens and going into buy my art supplies, and at this old art store next to the art school run by these old rednecks, and you know, them using the N-word and just being sort of shocked by it. Because I grew up in Atlanta, and I grew up in Atlanta in the, you know, basically the civil rights era. You know, Daddy King would come teach at my school, you know, Martin Luther King's father. But, you know, among all of these musicians, you know, it was like R&B music was a big deal. And, you know, any kind of racism was really frowned upon. Feminism was a big deal. Out queer culture was a really big deal. So there was this landscape that was laid out in front of us that allowed us to do so much. And I'm thankful for it, that we all sort of happened into it. I ascribe to the Brian Eno's concept of scenism, that it all comes out of a certain time, place, and the group of people that are all there, that everybody contributed to it. It wasn't, a scene didn't develop because there were some bands that played great music and then people came there for that. The bands were the symptom of all the great things that were sort of going on.
Well, I think this is an interesting.
Yeah, we're going on.
No, it's okay. But Jay and I, it might have been the last episode or 2 episodes ago, talked about, we revisited Nutramilk Hotel's album In the Aeroplane Over the Sea.
Yeah.
That was a band that was not originally they were from, I believe, Ruston, Louisiana, and like a lot of the, like Olivia Tremor Control and these Elephant Six bands, they kind of came to Athens and developed based on, you know, were attracted to what was going on there, and obviously school and those factors. And then when I, you know, my consciousness as far as Athens sort of started in the 90s, not only because of R.E.M, but bands like Of Montreal, which almost seems like the natural progression of when you're talking about this culture that had developed in the 80s. Of Montreal seems like the natural sort of evolution out of the B-52s, out of these more experimental and New York influenced artists, and Kevin Barnes taking it in a completely wild and different direction. And I don't think I made that linkage until you guys started talking about it. And that's really fascinating to hear how this has been such a consistent scene in that respect.
Yeah. Well,
what do you think, Ray?
Well, I think it's, I mean, one part is we're skipping over a whole sort of story of the mid 80s to late 80s and early 90s bands. And that happened between the time period that we've been talking about, early 80s to mid 80s, and the Elephant Six Collective, that's really more about the mid 90s. And those are bands like the Barbecue Killers, which is really, that's really the band that in many ways is the kind of leader of the anti-R.E.M crowd. And by that, I don't mean that they hate R.E.M. I mean that they're just like, we're not following that model. We're not sounding like that. We're not going to be that, you know. I don't mean that they don't like them personally. But maybe they do, maybe they don't. But they sort of, in the beginning, just cannot stop kind of like spoofing and goofing on R.E.M because they think the R.E.M people take themselves too seriously. And they're very much sonically more moving towards a harder edge sound than early 80s Athens bands. But performatively, you know, they've got members that are not straight. They have their own very queer aesthetic. And they've got 2 women. They've got Claire Horn on guitar, who's very much in the line of guitar players from Athens that invent their own tunings and their own ways of playing, you know, self-taught guitar players. And I think that we have to sort of acknowledge those groups. as a kind of bridge to where a band like Of Montreal is going to end up. Because the Barbecue Killers were, if they came out like a few years after they did, especially right along the moment when Riot Girl is breaking open, they would have been huge.
Oh, 100%.
They would have been huge because Laura Carter was so charismatic, and this is Laura Carter 1. There are 2 important Laura Carters in Athens music, and I'm speaking of the older one. But the Barbecue Killers and other bands that they were connected to, Time Toy, Eat America, Izot Gap, Kilkenny Cats, although they went through many different variations, but a certain period of the Kilkenny Cats, Mercyland, which is David Barbie's really big deal band from that era. David Barbie started his first record company and had Mercyland before he operated recording studios. So that was a whole nother era, and those bands really felt like R.E.M. had sold out. That they had given up on this kind of glorious, original, inventive, anti-commercialism that had empowered the early scene. And I'm not saying this is necessarily fair, but that was the thinking.
Right.
And that they were going to not follow that path. They were absolutely not going to follow that R.E.M. path. Athens was full in the mid to late 80s of bands trying to be R.E.M. And then it was full of bands trying not to be R.E.M. So I think that's a really rich period musically. Bands like the Squalls have huge followings and are really bridging the kind of artsy music of Love Tractor and Pylon and what we later think of as jam bands, like Widespread Panic.
Widespread Panic, huge.
Yeah.
I have to second you on Barbecue Killers. I mean, they were one of my favorite Athens bands. And Laura and I were great friends. Arthur and I are still really good friends.
Yeah,
fact,
Arthur's a good friend of mine too.
We were texting the other night. And every time he comes to town, I get the chance to see him, which he's such a lovely guy. But Laura was just a blast. And, it was a candle burning at both ends, but her ideas, the way she drove everything. I mean, the stage presence. And she was sort of shocked because, I was from this arty band, and we were already on the road and touring and having some success and come back and we'd be one of the bands that she'd want to make fun of, but I loved it because I loved them so much, and they were doing exactly the right thing at the right time. You're 100% though correct. If it'd been 4 years later, they would have been enormous.
Yeah, and they would do things like go on the cable access channel. And I don't know if you guys remember, you'd have to be a pretty big R.E.M. fan, but R.E.M. made this huge big deal about how they would never lip sync in their videos. Michael Stipe wouldn't lip sync. And this was this big, big thing. And so it was always in the news, always reported on how authentic R.E.M. was. And so the Barbecue Killers go on the cable access TV program in Athens, and then they lip sync to the song When the Whip Comes Down, wearing a Butthole Surfers t-shirt, which is just a total jab at R.E.M. because the Butthole Surfers had been living in town and pranking on R.E.M. and
right.
and they were just so wildly inventive like that. Laura Carter, the Barbecue Killers staged, like one time they're playing, I think it was the Uptown, and the people carried her in strapped to a cross. It was like
I was there
imitating Christ. And this is during the Reaganite rise of the Christian right. The constant battle in town is with the Prince Avenue Baptist Church at the time, politically speaking. The mayor is for a while a member of that church, and there's constant fights over alcohol sales, and this church is trying to sort of spread its conservatism across the town. And she has the nerve to pretend to be God on the Saturday before Easter. So, they were just, they were fantastic. Do you remember that? Were you at that show, Mark?
I was at the show. She was crucified on stage, and then she got married. She got married to her girlfriend on stage. Yeah,
that was a great show.
I loved them. I mean, Laura Carter had the best fuck you attitude to stuff, and she was fearless. And it also goes back to this idea of queer culture and feminism. I can't stress enough about this feminist concept that so many of these women that were in this, creating this music had. You know, they weren't these girls that were, you know, Athens was full of women that were there to get their MRS degrees. And these, the gals that we all loved and hung out with were the complete opposite of that. They were greater, if not equal, greater than all the guys. And they kicked our asses and they kept us in line. You know, I think it was the girls and the queers, you know?
Yeah. And some of the girls were queer too.
Poor straight boys were running scared from it all.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also worth establishing the context of a time when feminism is really under assault in the mainstream popular culture during the Reagan era. You know, it's had its 70s moment and it's in retreat. And so it was very, very refreshing to see these incredibly strong women just defy all gender conventions, whether they were queer or not, and just, you know, make their own music. It was inspiring.
It even goes into the 90s with Linda Hopper and Magna Pop.
Yeah. Well, and OOK was fantastic in the 80s. I loved OOK.
Yeah, I mean, in January, we did a show with OOK and Magna Pop, which Linda Hopper and I said, we'll get both the bands together so you and I have a whole weekend we can hang out together because we're best friends. Another funny thing about all of this is a lot of us were in the same dorm in Athens at freshman year or freshman sophomore year. We were all in Reed Hall. Bill and Mike from R.E.M, Sandy Phipps, who ended up being in part of R.E.M's management team, Linda Hopper, who was in OOK, and Magna Pop, myself, Sam Seawright, artist, just a number of people that were part of this scene. And again, the scene was so important to everything that we all sort of lived together under one roof, you know, as kids just started university. And then we moved out of that and lived in the same houses with each other. You know, a lot of it, you know, there's other people that left. It's sort of a side story, I guess. That's something I won't go into unless you want to, but like people that left Athens and came to New York and really sort of created this East Village scene that is now results in RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah.
There was Mark Fred, who
from
was
Atlanta, for example.
Yeah, but Mark Fred, who was part of the Athens scene, also had this drag persona named Happy Face.
Yeah.
That was tied in with RuPaul and the Atlanta guys. Larry T, who wrote Supermodel, who was my boyfriend at the time. We were like 19 years old. He was my Atlanta boyfriend who played in the Fans. I saw him on stage, like, oh my God, he's the cutest. And that all tied in. And Mark Fred was part of that. It's a whole nother side story that is now RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah.
That was this tie in between Athens and Atlanta, and that same sort of queer aesthetic that was happening, that you go on YouTube and TikTok and you see all these teenage queer kids that are using the lingo that we were coming up with back then.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's just, you know, it's great. It's wonderful. But you know, Athens had an effect all over the place. We would go on tour. We'd play Seattle and we would see the guys from Nirvana in the audience. You know, all of, you know, and then the next thing was Nirvana was big. I remember I was at Mike Mills' house one night and we were listening to Nevermind and some Def Leppard record. And like, just, you know, the record company would send us records and we just like listened to it. And we put on Nevermind and we both looked at each other and said, oh, wow, everything's about to change. Because we could hear it. This is this great, great band. And then I remember doing a show, and this is probably early 90s, playing a show in New York. And anytime we played New York, we would always play at Maxwell's in Hoboken because Steve Fallon was a great friend, and he owned this tiny club that was the whole center of this Hoboken scene. And it was de rigueur to play there because it was the best time you would have. All your friends would be there. It was a tiny, tiny club. And Bob Mould was there hanging out with Steve. Again, more queers. And Bob, I was talking to Bob. I said, "What are you doing? Oh, why are you in New York?" I said, "Oh, we just got off tour." I guess it was Husker Du.
Yeah.
Or maybe he'd done a solo tour. I can't remember. But he just got off tour and come back from Europe. And I said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "Well, we had an opening band, this band Nirvana." And he said, "Those guys are going to be dead because they were just like destroying everything, and they were all doing drugs and just." It was really prescient what he was saying. You know, a few years later, Kurt Cobain was gone, which was a great loss. You know, for an amazing talent. But you know, this sort of reach of Athens, it did reach all across the country.
I thought you were going to tell the story about introducing Bob Mould to his future partner.
Oh, well, Bob's written the whole book. Bob's written the whole book about that. But yeah, you know, Kevin. In fact, I just spent 4th of July with Kevin, who was Bob's boyfriend, managed Bob and Sugar and Kirsten Hirsch. Like Kevin was at our show at Maxwell's, and Bob was there. I'm like, "What are you doing here, Kevin?" It's like, "Oh, I'm hanging out with." He had yet to meet Bob, and he said, "I'm hanging out with Steve," because anytime you come up there, you want to hang out with Steve Fallon, who owned Maxwell's, and also had a record label. You know, if not for Steve Fallon, there really wouldn't have been the Feelies, the Bongos, all of those sort of New Jersey Hoboken bands. And that's the night that Kevin and Bob met, which was started a very rocky relationship that, you know, Bob ended up writing a biography, which really the biography is about his relationship with Kevin. So, but that's a whole nother story. There are lots of these sides.
It's a good one, though.
It's a good one. It's a good one. You know.
I want to come back though and push back just a tiny bit on the feminist narrative. I mean, I definitely do think those women were there, and as I said, they were inspiring. But you know, there were plenty of, and Mark was never one of these people, but there was plenty of sexism there too.
I agree. I agree 100%. Yeah.
And I won't name names, but there was a lot of you know, not very good behavior that would get Me Too'd today. That was there too.
I totally agree with that. You know,
Yeah.
not from the queer boys.
No, not you. No way.
No, not from the queer boys. I mean, we were feminist allies, and the feminists were queer allies all the way.
Yeah.
And we all knew each other. We were all best friends. But you know, a lot of the straight boy rockers, especially that came there later.
Yeah.
I would say there were issues. You know, there were issues. But they would also get called out. But you know, there are Me Too moments with some of that, and I know some gals have called that out, and good for them.
Yeah.
But not with my girlfriends. My girlfriends would have kicked ass.
But I do think that the amateurism of the scene, the amateurism that was prized, and the kind of ethic that people learned in the art school of try anything. Just, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to do it for your whole life. You can explore new mediums of art, and music can be explored in the same way. I think that actually, despite the fact that there were some sexist guys in the music world, that actually provided a lot of space for women to become musicians. That's not always the case in scenes. So you have somebody like Linda Stipe and Linda Hopper, and they create this great band, OK. And Linda Stipe is, of course, Michael Stipe's sister, but she is also a very talented and great musician in her own right. And, you know, she had experienced this incredible creative community in Athens, but then she told me stories when I was interviewing her of being, just having people just be horrifically awful to them when they're trying to sound check, of performing in places where more than once somebody unplugged her bass during a show because they didn't like the way she was playing. They would tell her like she's not hitting the strings hard enough and not to play that way. So, you know, people definitely experienced sexism. And some of what I'm talking about with Linda's stories were road stories from playing other places. But
yeah,
I think
I can't imagine that happening in Athens. Like,
no, that didn't happen in Athens. But just I think it's important to sort of suggest to say that the town, though there was definitely some sexism, was more nurturing than many other places that were developing music scenes at the time. I would argue of women musicians.
well, especially when you look at the entire music industry, you know, even today, it's so male dominated and so completely sexist. And, you know, when we were talking to record companies and dealing with all that, I mean, it was such a straight world. And to be gay and to be out was such a no-no. And it was a really, you know, it's tough. I mean, even the B-52s, I mean, come on. Everyone knew they were gay, but they couldn't come out until the 90s to be really out professionally, because the record business was so macho and was really anti-queer, anti-feminist. And that's the structure of that business. I think the movie business is the same way. I mean, obviously you see it from the Me Too movement.
But I would also say that the entire culture was that way, just to add to what you're saying. I mean, in the 80s, the culture was so homophobic, so anti-feminist. And there was something that was a mainstream culture back then that I think it's hard for young people today to understand, that there ever was something so kind of centralized and conventional about culture. But the culture wasn't fragmented like it is now. There was a mainstream, and it was extremely anti-gay, anti-queer, and anti-feminist.
And racist.
Yeah, and absolutely horrifically racist, which you know is a topic we could talk more about in the Athens scene, which is interesting. One of the things I found really interesting writing my book was how many key players in the scene had lived through school integration in high school. You know, lived through the integration of the public schools, and that had been part of their formative experience. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, the scene is very white, and I think that's an issue. It's not 100% white, but it's white. And I would argue that many people commit what we would now call microaggressions. It's not a place that's perfect in any way, but it is a place that shapes itself in opposition to a pretty outwardly racist white Southern middle class and working class culture at the time. That is, you know, you heard people say the N-word. I mean, I'm younger than Mark, and you heard it a lot. And so there is a way in which the scene is created against that vision. Like, isn't there some other way to be a white Southerner besides that kind of a racist Yahoo idiot vision? And so I think that's another important aspect of Athens that maybe we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, there's 2 points to that. One is that I discovered after my freshman year at University of Georgia was that nothing that really entered my mind, but that University of Georgia was a traditionally 100% white school, even though Charlene Hunter Galt was the first person to integrate the school, you know. But even in my day, it's not where any black kids that I knew from Atlanta wanted to go to school. They were going to, you know, I remember coming back and after my freshman year, I had a summer job, and I was working in operations at a bank, and a friend of mine from high school was there. And I said, well, I haven't seen you. Where have you been? He said, oh, I'm off at school in D.C. I'm like, where? And he said, Howard. Oh, and I said, well, I went to the University of Georgia. Why didn't you come there? And he looked at me, like, gave me this look like, are you stupid? You know, why the fuck would I go to the University of Georgia? And I didn't realize it until then. It just didn't dawn on me in my sort of coddled white world that I grew up in, that any person of color that wanted to go to school would certainly not choose to go to the University of Georgia, because all the
90% white through the 80s, 90% white, and much smaller than 10%. Well, I looked up the statistics, so I can tell you that it was, but that doesn't mean it's all African Americans, that 10%. And the African American population is about 5-6% during that.
If you were African American, it wasn't a school you wanted to go to. And if I'd been African American, I certainly would not have wanted to go there. Looking back, I mean, you know, I was young and naive when I first went to school there, and I thought that I was enlightened, but I wasn't, and I really realized it until, like I said, after my freshman year, I realized, oh, those rednecks that we're all hiding from in Athens, you know, they're also racist. This is why there are no black students at the school. And, you know, it took a black kid to explain it to me. But, you know, I still go back to say, among the crowd of people that we were with in the art school, those sort of behaviors were unacceptable, at least in my formative years in Athens. And being in that school, and specifically art school, because we didn't consider ourselves students at the University of Georgia at all. You know, we'd walk outside the art school and there'd be some Camaro pulled up in front, just waiting for us to walk out. And, you know, a bunch of frat boys in it. And the minute we'd open the door, walk outside the school, you'd hear, they'd scream out of the car, art students are faggots. And then they'd floor it, and you'd hear the wheels spin off, and, you know, they'd go hightailing it down the street laughing. And we're, you know, we didn't think it was particularly insulting. We thought it was actually hilarious that they were doing that. But, and, you know, we were very we protected ourselves, I think. And then it changed. I mean, especially when I look back at Athens in the 90s, it was very, very much a different place because, you know, everyone in the country knew about it. And many bands had moved there to work there. I was really happy when Elephant Six happened in Athens, because to me, they were one of the few groups of people or artists that moved there that really had the same ethos that we all had. When we started out, they were there. They knew it was sort of a fertile ground for them to be able to do whatever they wanted. And I really like a lot of what came out of those bands. And I still do today, you know, Apples and Stereo, Olivia Tremor Control, all of that.
Elf Power.
Elf Power,
yeah.
Neutral Milk Hotel, all of that. You know, the other band that's never talked about in the 90s, which is, to me, one of the greatest Athens bands of all time, the Glands.
Yeah.
Really, really terrific band. Made up of, well, it's funny because now we've sort of co-opted half of the Glands into Love Tractor, and Pylon Reenactment Society has co-opted them. But Doug, who was the bass player in the Glands, joined Love Tractor in the mid-90s. And now Joe, who was the drummer of the Glands, is Love Tractor's drummer. But, you know, and I'd known Ross for years, and I had no idea that he was a songwriter. At no idea whatsoever. And then they put out that album, and I have to tell you, I was floored. First of all, how brilliant the record was, and floored that Ross was such a great songwriter. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the band, the Glands.
No.
That'd be a good one to do in the digging up thing. I mean, that's a good.
Sounds
that's
like
a good
it.
option.
Is Double Thriller the album you're talking about?
Yeah. And I think, was it New West just re-released all of their stuff, I believe. Is it New West, Grace? Do you know?
I don't know. They just did Pylon. I think they're on an Athens kick.
Yeah, they're. It's funny because we have the same release date as Pylon's box set, which is a great also example of how Athens works with this friendship community. Is any other town would be going, oh no, we have the same release date. You know, we're competing against each other. You know, Vanessa and I text, we're like, oh, we have the same release date. Let's celebrate. What can we do together to make this all happen for each other? So it's a different, it's still that among this group, this crowd of people. You know, some of the later bands, I don't know. But, you know, also all of the Elephant Six guys that I know are phenomenal people. They're great musicians. They come over and play with us when I'm down in Athens, and help us out. Like, you know, we were doing some shows. I couldn't remember any of the songs, and you know, some of those guys, Brian Poole would come over and teach me my songs that I played here.
One person we haven't talked about, I think, that again sort of bridges the stories we're talking about, is Vic Chestnut. I mean, you can't talk about Athens music without talking about Vic Chestnut, the best songwriter ever to come out of Athens.
Absolutely.
The man, an absolute genius writer, you know, with a difficult story, but he was a good friend of mine for years, and his death was really tragic.
Oh, it's so tragic. It still echoes. And there's so much drama still surrounding that. He was Vic. Everyone knew Vic. And then all of a sudden, Vic was writing songs and playing music. And I remember, like, we would be on tour, and I would come back, and everyone's like, oh, Vic's doing this. You need to go see it. And I'd be like, really? And I'd go, and I'd, you know, be bowled over. First time I saw him perform, because I'd known him. And I had no idea that he could write songs. And I went and saw him, and I was like, oh, my God, this is incredible. And then the last time I think I saw him play was maybe 2000 at South by Southwest. I was working for IPG, which is a holding company that owns a ton of advertising agency. And I ran the entertainment division for them. So I'd always have to go to these different conventions to search out acts and whatnot, because, you know, if I need to license music or do sync stuff for music, or find an actor or performer to be in a commercial or in something else, you know, I needed to be around. And in fact, it was that same South by Southwest that was the last time I got to see Vic play, because I didn't live in Athens any longer. And I also saw the Glands play, and which was one of the best sort of like weekends of my life, because Vic was at the height of his power and his band. And he played upstairs someplace in Austin, and it was one of those where I was so taken aback that after the show, I didn't even go back to talk to anyone in the band. I was just so blown away. I just had to leave, go back to my hotel, and just let it digest. I enjoyed it so much. And I can't express what a great talent he was. And that he really, to me, was Athens through the 90s. That he was the torchbearer, and kept things going, and some that we all looked up to. Also, J.D. Hollingsworth. I mean, you know, turns out to be this great writer.
Yeah, I just don't want to leave the story of Vic without seconding what a genius.
Absolutely.
He would play at the Grit just out on the patio, and then he played at the 40 watt. The posters would say every Tuesday till hell freezes over. And that's pretty, I mean, it was like a year of Tuesdays he played. And then I owned a place called the Downstairs for about 3.5 years. And he would play there and just pack the place. But the thing about Vic was that most of the time he would be absolutely transportively brilliant. But the time invariably when you got your friend to go who'd never seen him perform, or your friend from Atlanta drove up, or, you know, you made some big deal effort to get somebody important there, he would just suck. He would get drunk or stoned or something, and just really fuck it up. Like he thought it was part of his art performance practice to sometimes just be really bad and, like, you know, not give the audience what they wanted. And invariably that would have been when you made some huge effort to get someone to go who'd never seen him. And, you know, he always had a little bit of a self-sabotaging streak in him. And, you know, a kind of fuck you to the business thing going.
Yeah, he certainly did.
So the fact that he titled his major label debut About to Choke, and then, you know, a couple of shows into his major tour, just took off in the van and left the rest of his band, including his wife, just standing on the street. And I think it was St. Louis, but I might have the wrong town, without even their like, luggage. You know, that was Vic. And, you know, there was the joy of Vic, and then there was the jerkiness of Vic. And it was all part of the package.
It was part of the package, 100% part of the package. You know, Kevin O'Neill will tell you, you know, talk about, there are plenty of people. You know, we were touring at that point when he was really starting to take off, and we were gone, just like R.E.M. was gone. You know, we were out on the road working, and then after that, I was gone. You know, after we retired the band for like 5 years, you know, I was in DC and New York. So I was completely out of the business in the sense. I wanted to be out of the business to get away from it before we sort of got it back together. And, you know, when I got to see Vic again, it just, you know, drove it all home to me that this is I always felt like he was sort of the culmination of everything that had happened in Athens, that he was this angel on the head of a pin.
Yeah. He was really interesting too, because he started out with his musical start in Athens was with the folk music people. There was a huge folk music community in Athens, and Art Rosenbaum, who was an art professor, was very involved there. And that's the whole connection to all the folk artists and folk musicians, comes through people like Art Rosenbaum and another art professor, Andy Nassis. But Vic got really into the folk music community and the songwriting of old country music and folk music. And that is how he started performing. And they had a rule that you couldn't play your own music. In the music scene, it was bad to play covers. You had to make your own music. It was to be original. In the folk music scene, you had to play covers. You weren't allowed to play your own music. And all the folk music people that I interviewed said that they finally, after a while, realized they just had to make an exception for Vic. They just let him play whatever he wanted because it was going to be worth it to hear it. But you can hear those roots of his music, I think, really strongly on his first couple of albums, which for me just really remain absolute go-to music.
It's great. It's like one of the top 10 albums out of that town. But again, it's another one of these great records that came out of Athens and, you know, launched 1,000 other ships, you know. So much great stuff, and he was such a talent.
But you know, I think in some ways there's another story there to tell too, that he would never have been recorded if it wasn't for Michael Stipe. Michael Stipe paid for those early recording sessions and connected him to his record label, Texas Hotel. What was that friend of Michael's? I'm totally blanking on Michael's friend that was one of the people who ran Texas Hotel.
I can't remember.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, Michael really, there were periods in the late 80s when R.E.M. was home a lot, and those guys got very involved in the town, all of them, producing music, jumping up on stage and playing with local bands, doing things like, not just producing, but helping pay for John Keane's studio to record Vic, and that was just really wonderful. I mean, they were sort of learning from the scene and giving back to the scene, but they were so famous and they had so many resources. And I think that's just part of R.E.M's story that not that many people know, how much they participated in and gave and shared and also got from the town in that late 80s, early 90s moment when they stopped touring, and yet they hadn't moved away. They all still lived there.
Yeah, it's true. Because there were points where, especially when R.E.M. got their Warner Brothers deal, that they had that chance to sit back, which at the time was the biggest record deal I think anyone had ever gotten. They got that $80 million advance. And that was when what was their first Warner Brothers record? Was it Green?
It was Green. Yeah.
And they toured a couple of those, and then they came back and they sat back and they said, you know what, we spent the whole 80s touring nonstop. We're taking some time off. We're selling your records, and they were selling records right and left for Warner Brothers. And, Warner Brothers was a great label at that time because it was an artist label.
Out of time. I mean, they just didn't tour then. They refused. Fine, we're not going to do it. But you couldn't go out in Athens without seeing them around 1989 or so.
Yeah.
89, 90. If they were not on tour, they weren't on tour as much in those years. You'd see them all the time out.
Yeah.
And I think that was important for the scene, for a lot of those bands that they helped.
Which is so funny because those were the years, 89, like from 86 to probably 92, we were on tour nonstop. And I, with you know, I'd come back and maybe I'd see the guys in R.E.M, but they'd always go like, "Oh, where have you guys been? You need to go on tour." And be like, "Dudes, we just got back from a year on tour. Where have you been?" And you know, it was always sort of a joke with them, because it was like ships passing in the night. And it's funny because I never realized how big R.E.M had gotten until maybe the late 90s. Because I just, you know, we were so involved in our career and doing our own stuff. And our paths would never cross on the road. And we'd always just hear about them. Oh, R.E.M, this, that, and the other. And then in the late 90s, I remember I was sitting around talking to Bill Berry, and he was like, "Oh, man," we were talking about, you know, old road stories and war stories of, you know, rock and roll stories. And he was saying, "Yeah, we were playing this arena or that football field," and I was like, "Oh, wait, I didn't realize." It's like I had no clue. I honestly had no clue. I just knew that they were doing really well. And which is ironic. I mean, it was just sort of my, I guess, planned ignorance to all of that. But they did, you know, to reiterate Grace's point, is they came back in and, you know, wanted to help everyone out. In fact, when Love Tractor was really kind of like falling apart and we knew we needed to stop because we'd been on the road so long, Peter came in and said, "Mike needs to take a break. Mike wants to go on." Mike, who played in Love Tractor, "I'll replace him and go on the road with you guys." And I looked at Peter and said, "Are you crazy? I don't want to be on the road anymore." You know, but that's sort of how it worked. I mean, he didn't want to be. That's also typical Peter. He's still on the road. He's still out playing. You know, if he doesn't have a band or something like that, I mean, he must be going insane right now under COVID because he can't go tour because he loves rock and roll so much. He loves performing. But that was Peter. And also Mill, all those guys. I mean, they were really, you know, they were real boosters. And so were the B-52s, I would say. Very much so. Anyone that, you know, everyone shared in their success. They paid it forward. Would you disagree with that, Grace? I mean, you've spoken to so many people.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think that the R.E.M guys, you know, especially given that a certain segment of the earliest scene folks thought that they weren't arty enough, that they were too pop, and there was this whole kind of like little bit of a thing about R.E.M's not really, you know, not really part of our thing because they are too accessible and frat boys like them in the very, very early days. I think that that it's a sign of just how amazingly generous and what great people they are, that they actually that didn't stick with them. You know what I mean? Like they left that behind as the kind of like high school social spat that it was. You know what? Like a high school thing that it was, and they didn't take it to heart too much, and they were huge boosters of the town. I mean, just think about how Pylon's entire story would be different without R.E.M. Without R.E.M. really in many ways sort of resurrecting interest in Pylon after they had broken up in '83, with the comments about what a great band they were as R.E.M. was becoming huge, and then the cover song they did, the cover of Crazy, and talking, you know, and the famous quote when asked, you know, when they became, you know, the Rolling Stones said they're the greatest rock and roll band in America, and they said, no, you know, it's Pylon. So,
exactly.
they're just so generous. They're the way that they, you know, really supported and boosted other local bands, you know, in two ways. By staying in town, they would have already done that. I mean, even if they didn't personally do it, just the fact that they committed themselves to staying in town all those years, but also just the way that they individually and collectively supported other musicians with opening slots on their tours, with you know, helping pay for recording, with agreeing to produce records when that would help a record company sign another local band. I mean, they just did so many things for people.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, even I would say before R.E.M. was doing that, the B-52s were doing that to help everyone out. But then, you know, they were gone. You know, they had moved away. And at a certain point, their influence over what was happening at Athens really died off. And whereas R.E.M., you know, the boosterism was, you know, they felt like this town gave us everything. And we're going to pay it back and take care of whoever these younger bands are coming up that we think deserve a chance. And they certainly put their money where their mouth is when it comes to that. But I also love that, you know, the fact that, there were bands, people thought they weren't arty enough because, you know, they would come out and they were so smart because they would come out and play. They wouldn't have a full set. And so they'd mix in their set until they had enough of their own original songs. They'd mix it in with cover songs that they kicked ass. The cover songs were great. Michael looked like Elvis on stage.
And he sounded like him too in those early moments. He had sort of Cramps-esque kind of, you know, Elvis sort of style going. Yeah. Very different from Murmur.
For me, I had sort of a different view of it in a sense that because Bill played in Love Tractor, and you know, at a point he was seriously gonna stay in Love Tractor and leave R.E.M. And he came to us, and what, you know, his decision was, he came to us, he said, "Are you guys willing to quit school and go on the road and make a go of this?" And Armstead and I, we had maybe another semester, a quarter of school work to do. And I was like, no, I'm this close, I want to finish. And he went to Peter and Michael and Mike and posed the same question. And they said, yes, we're ready to quit school and do this. And to me, that showed this ambition and this intent and these brains, especially with Bill, because Bill understood the record industry more so than anyone else in the scene, because he'd worked for Capricorn Records and something else.
He worked
you know,
for
in
the
high
booking company for Capricorn, the booking arm that Copeland started. Later he called it FBI, but he was working for their Capricorn's booking agency.
Yeah, and Bill really understood the business and the fact that, and you know, he was sort of the whip cracker in early R.E.M. before, you know, Jefferson or Burtis came along, and he drove things. And the simple fact that, you know, he posed that question to us and then he posed it to them showed to me this really smart intent, and was a different window where other people were saying, oh, you know, they're a commercial sell. I'm like, no, they're incredibly smart in what they're doing, because Bill is still to this day one of the smartest people I know. Yeah. He saw what was happening and he knew that the time was right to strike right then and there. And he knew not to wait.
Well, I mean, he really did have that insider knowledge because he worked with Ian Copeland, and Ian Copeland, of course, his brother was in the police and his other brother started IRS Records. So the reason that R.E.M. opened for the police when they were like barely 6 months old at the Fox in Atlanta is because Bill knew these people. He had those.
That's right.
So they had to be great, of course, to take, you know, to make the music, given the connections. Connections aren't everything, but Bill understood the business. Ricky Wilson had to go to the University of Georgia Law Library and look up information about how to figure out how to sign their contracts. You know, he was the amateur law student. But that just shows you how different things were, but between the two. But Bill had the savvy.
Bill had 100% savvy, you know, and I mean, I still talk to Bill weekly, in fact, you know, because we're still all involved musically. And,
you know, as it trickles out who wrote what song in R.E.M., or at least you hear gossip about it, I'd say he was a really damn good songwriter, too.
Yeah, I'm not going to go on record with any of that. But
you don't have to. I'm just saying it in a general way.
Yeah. And yeah, I think you'll notice the difference from when he was in the band and when he was out of the band. Bill, I'll just say Bill's a great songwriter.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Really great.
He's a great songwriter.
Was it in January? I was at his house, and he'd been recording some stuff, and we were practicing at his house, rehearsing, and I was up in his kitchen, and he said, I just recorded something. I said, let me hear it. And he played it, and he finished playing. I said, okay, so is that going to be a Love Tractor song? Because it was so good. It was so absolutely, it was this instrumental that was so good.
Yeah.
And, he's just like, yeah, I'll write this stuff. He doesn't care about putting it out. He's more interested. Owen, his son, is a great songwriter, has a killer band. And there's somebody to look out for. I don't know what the name will be. They have a name. I'm not going to go into that because I know the name will change, but these guys are really, really talented, and we'll talk about inheriting it.
Reminds me that we haven't given Tim and Jason a chance to say a word.
No, this has been great. Jay, you haven't had to do any work.
This is the easiest episode we've ever had to do. I'm so grateful.
So great to talk to Mark about this.
You can just insert your questions, edit your questions in.
You've answered like so many that we typically ask that I'm like,
I know. You just flew right by them.
Because one of the big ones we always have to kind of prompt is like, who were the influencers or the kind of the promoters of the scene that maybe weren't the musicians, right? There's always somebody. And I think Jeremy Ayres obviously is that person, one of those people.
Danny Beard.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though he's in Atlanta, he's huge.
And we usually ask about what bands do people maybe not know that were important to the scene. And you guys covered that as well. So yeah, you kind of hit on the stuff we usually do. So appreciate that.
Answer those questions. If not for Danny Beard, there would be no Athens music thing that ever happened because he provided the recording outlet for it, and was, invested in it. He, to this day, Danny he's a super shy man. He's brilliant. He has great taste in music, had great taste in music back then. Jeremy Ayres also. And some of the people that took a chance, like even members of bands like Curtis Crow and Bill Tabor, who put up the money to open the 40 Watt Club. There are these folks, when it comes to these bands, the Barbecue Killers, Limbo District, were bands that no one's ever heard of, and they should have. Izot Gap is another one.
I would also argue that some of the women that ran clubs and managed clubs and supported places should be mentioned, like Jennifer Hartley, who was an artist who ran the Grit, which was, before it was a restaurant, it was a coffee shop, music and a gallery, but also musicians would play there, like Vic Chestnut, very importantly, in his early days. That's actually where Vic met all these folk music people, because the folk music and dance society had their weekly hootenanny at the Grit, which was at that time a coffee shop art gallery.
And that was also Jenna Shue. It was Jennifer and Jenna Shue.
And so they're just key figures like that. That
Valina Vigo
never sort of get the glory, but without somebody nurturing those kinds of spaces where things can happen. I mean, even in later years, the work of people like Valina Vago and Barry, who Barry ultimately becoming the owner of the 40 Watt to keep that club going. I keep thinking about them in this COVID time and wondering how the 40 Watt and any of these clubs are going to survive. I mean, I think if any of them do, the 40 Watt will, but again, I don't think people really know that story of Athens, that the most important club in town is run and owned by, it's by women.
It's by women. Yeah. Valina and Barry. And, Valina's one of the best bookers in the business. And, luckily they own that building. So.
Didn't Barry get the building in the divorce from Peter? That's what's always the gossip.
Yes. Yeah. And the house. I think the divorce I think she, that's their private business. So I could just
just
surmise.
That's all I meant. She got the building. I didn't mean it was anything else bad about it. Just she got the building.
No, not at all. Listen, they're friends. Peter and Barry are friends. They parted amicably, and
Love happened.
Love happens. Marriages come, marriages go. People stay friends. That's the one thing about Athens is we're all still friends. Everybody is. In 2005, we had sort of this crazy Athens reunion of all of the people that had gone to art school and played in the bands and were writers for the papers and this, that, and the other. It was called Athens Rewind, and it was like a family reunion. I had, by 11 o'clock in the evening, I had lost my voice. I arrived in Athens. I was staying at the Holiday Inn, downtown Athens. I get out of my car. There's Mark Fred, a la Happy Face, who basically started the whole scene at the Pyramid Club in New York. And Mark Fred and I shared a house with Michael Stipe, with, I don't know, and name some other bands. We all lived in the same house, 169 Barbara Street. And I lost, my voice was gone. I was like talking like this because I'd seen so many people I hadn't seen in years. And these people were all best friends. It's so much love. I can't tell you what it's like. It's the oddest thing.
Well, I want to just say to that still goes on, I think, because my daughter is now a student at the University of Georgia. And so when she told me she had bought a ticket to the Love Tractor OOK reunion show
I met her. I talked to her. Yeah.
I said, well, you got to introduce yourself to these folks. And I immediately, got in touch with Mark, and I said, my daughter's coming. And Armstead and Mark, they just brought Emma and her friends backstage and wined and dined them. These are 19-year-olds. They're just their eyes are as big as saucers. They just can't believe it. They feel like they're in with royalty, getting to people are like, oh my God, the people in the band.
I think we were trying to introduce them to Owen, Bill's son.
So they just were blown away by that, and that is the way that Mark is not lying when he says that about Athens people, and it's extended to the children of people that were on the fringes. they get enveloped in that love fest as well. So thank you.
We've heard a lot of similar themes when with other scenes, but I think the one that's standing out to me on this one is just the giving back part of it. I don't know that we've heard that as strong before, which is really unique and really cool to learn. So thanks for sharing that.
I mean, and we didn't even begin to get into all the ways that R.E.M. gave back to the community. I mean, they had a foundation, and they would give to anything in Athens that was happening that was a progressive or environmental cause. They would play benefits early on, but then they would just give money, and they almost single-handedly just changed the politics of the town because they were backing liberal candidates, and the sort of old establishment of Athens had no idea that anyone had any money. How can these long-haired, scrungy musicians have any money? And R.E.M. backed Gwynno Looney, the first time we ever had a liberal politician win in Athens. And they were like $5,000 or something, but this was a lot of money in Athens politics back then. And she won the head of when the county and city came together, the head of the whole new unified government. And the old Athens establishment had no idea what hit them because they just didn't understand any of these, the best they could come up with was hippies, right? Which wasn't really the right term, that any of these people could have any money. This was just beyond their comprehension.
Well, it was also Grace, it was like our revenge. Because we were the ones that were called queer and fag and weirdo and chased all over town. I remember Michael being chased out in front of the SAE house and running down the street holding a globe, because we would get up in the morning and put on these crazy outfits to go to art school, like typical art students. I might be in my pajamas in design class, but you know, it was like sort of the big fuck you to Athens establishment, because we were the ones that were the outsiders. We'd been treated like crap by all these Yahoo rednecks. And then R.E.M. made a bunch of money and made the decision that they were going to stay and live in the town. And they could afford to say, okay, now, guess what? Fuck all of you. We can change the whole political base of this town. We've got the clout and the money to do it.
The most exciting thing to live through ever. It was just to watch these people go down in Georgia, you know, the feminist, her main opponent called her supporters feminist. What was it, Mark? They made a t-shirt, feminist hippies, the blacks, feminist hippies, and something else for that loony woman, because her name was Gwen Looney.
Yeah. Yeah, Looney. They called her Looney.
She beat him, and that was sweet revenge. That was really great.
It was such sweet revenge.
Some liberal sense. So
those tactics sound very familiar.
100%. It's 100% familiar.
Childless names for your opponent.
Yeah.
A child, you know, just especially after watching any of that RNC stuff, which was like the Carol Burnett show. The whole thing was like a sketch on the Carol Burnett show from the 70s. You know, I was just aghast. I mean, I was laughing through my tears.
Well, to me, I have to say, I didn't quite think it was that funny. To me, it looked like what North Korea would put on if they were doing a convention. So,
which is pretty funny.
I was having a hard time laughing.
You know, it's everything of it's out of my control. So, you know, I can be horrified, or I can just stand back and, you know, be a satirist and find humor in it, because it's out of my control.
So how do we get R.E.M. to save us?
You know, call Michael. Come on, Mark, can you call Bill Berry? You're talking to him anyway, so you can get him on that.
I think they feel like they've done enough saving.
Yeah, well, we need all the help we can get.
We might need to make another call. I think we need one more big save here.
Yeah.
I know.
Go, unfortunately. This has been so fun, though.
Yeah. We like to wrap up. We've done this with some of the cities, and it's worked out. Some of it hasn't. When we talked about Boston, we kind of settled on there being a sound, that there was a sound to Boston with regards to its alternative rock sound, or Chicago had, you know, a lot of industrial influence because of Ministry and all these bands. And I'm curious if you were to describe Athens to someone, does Athens have a sound? Is there a certain band that sums up what Athens sounds like, or is it a variety of things?
It is a variety. Well, it depends on the time period of Athens. I would say one of the key things is that it doesn't have something that you can put your finger on, except that, you know, a sound that you can put your finger on, except that there's so many distinct sounds. And to me, it's kind of like a love track, where every song sort of sounds different. But early on, I would...
Absolutely right. There's not one sound. There's a real interest in people trying to, until you get the R.E.M. kind of copycat groups, which are always a little bit, everybody else kind of is, what are you doing? You know? But,
yeah.
And that doesn't happen really till the second half of the 80s, and there's not tons of them, but it's not cool to sound like somebody else. You have to have you have to try to have your own sound. You may not succeed, you may fail, but you have to try to have your own sound. I will say though that one very strong thing, it's not true of every Athens band, but it is a very strong commonality, is music you can dance to.
100%. That's what I was going to say. 4 on the floor.
Yeah.
Because it started out as entertainment for our friends, and also to blow our friends' minds. But everyone had to be able, it wasn't a concert where people stood or sat and watched a band. It was all about participation, and that it was dance.
And
so
there's a few exceptions, I would say, like, you know, maybe some people danced to Limbo District, but a lot of people didn't know how to. And, you know, Vic Chestnut wasn't much of a dance a dance musician, and that's
No.
a moment. But most of the bands that are known as Athens, you can dance to them.
Yeah, it's very
Well,
key.
We've gone way over our normal time, but I'm sure that the people listening are gonna be happy that we did, because this was a lot of fun, and not only a lot of fun, but it was extremely educational.
Yeah.
We learned so much about this scene. I'm so happy we finally got to talk about it and have you both on. Truly, this was exceptional. I want to plug the Love Tractor re-release is coming out. Would you say it was going to be this fall with the single and the re-release of the album?
We have a single coming out for Record Store Day, which has been moved to sometime in October.
Right.
And the album release is November 6th.
Okay. And where can people go to pick that up? Or where
well, right now it can be pre-ordered at Happy Birthday to Me Records. What is the URL? Hold on one second, I'll tell you. It is, you'll need to edit this.
It's fine.
The URL, yeah, hhbtm.com. That's hhbtm.com. You can go online and pre-order, and there are a number of pre-order packages with T-shirts, with colored vinyl. I prefer the white vinyl. CDs, buttons, bandanas, you name it, we got it.
And the band is on Facebook, I believe, has an active page there.
Facebook
Excellent.
and Instagram. Websites we're not so much interested in. It's sort of past the day of people having their own websites. It's coming from somebody that builds websites.
You're also talking to, yeah, that's what Mr. Jason is a designer as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fortunately or not, the people are on Facebook, so.
Well, you lead them from Facebook to a website.
Yeah. But, for bands, I just don't see a need for a band to have a website any longer. Other things for commerce, yes, but, we direct people to the label. Because I always feel like if I'm directing people to the label, it's going to, the label's going to sell more other records. They make more money. They can put more money into us, and they like us doing that, so they're going to pay more attention to us. So.
Well, thank you, Mark,
Yeah.
for coming on and sharing all the stories. And thank you to Grace, who has the book out, Cool Town, How Athens, Georgia Launched Alternative Music and Changed American Culture. That's out as of this spring. And suggest heading over. Yeah, as of this past spring.
Oh, past spring, yeah.
And do you have a website that people should go to grab that? Or do you want to send them to Amazon or some giant corporation like that?
I think it's great if you buy it from your local indie bookstore, whichever
there you go.
one that might be. If you don't have one, you can buy it from New Dominion Books in Charlottesville, and they'll ship it to you. You can buy it on the evil Amazon, but let's don't. And I do have a website. Although I now know from Mark and all of you that they're out of favor. I do have a website.
It's like having a MySpace page now.
It is. And it's somebody that was in the scene and has read the book. I wholeheartedly endorse the book. It is the definitive document of what has gone on there. So read that book.
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks for having us, Tim and Jason. Great to be here.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, guys.
Appreciate it.
All right.
A lot.
We're all wrapped up here. So if you guys need to go do things, feel free to do them. I know we kept you long.
Enjoy your Saturday.
When you were talking about the Boston scene, did you talk about the band? I think the band is called Come. They're a hardcore band because Arthur Johnson from the Barbecue Killers moved to Boston, and then he was in a Boston band. And another guy from Athens too, Sean, and I'm forgetting
Sean O'Brien.
Sean O'Brien. They were, I think Come was a foursome, and they were the bass player, drummers, the rhythm section.
I know what you're talking about because Chris Brokaw was in that band.
I remember that band. I don't remember if they came up in the episode or not.
Right. I know who they are because Chris Brokaw was in that band, and he was in some other stuff.
I just thought it was an interesting Boston connection. I didn't know if you knew about that. It's just an interesting little side tidbit.
Yeah, that was one of those bands where Jay and I worked in college radio in the 90s, so we definitely got that CD at the radio station amongst the 500 other CDs we would get every week from all the labels. And when it was, just getting dumped on every week, our new shipment from everybody. So yeah, I definitely remember the band, but I don't remember specifically if they came up on that episode. But that was a fun episode. It was with Bill Janovitz of Buffalo Tom and Kay Hanley of Letters to Cleo, and Aaron Perino of The Shield Divine, which was a lot of fun. All the Digging Your Scene episodes have been a blast. We've had great guests for all of them, so I definitely feel.
If you ever need someone to interview, Arthur would be. Having interviewed about 100 people for this book, Mark was a great interview, and Arthur was a great interview. Arthur also grew up in Atlanta, so he was going to the Atlanta clubs when he was in high school.
Me too.
And had just a great, Arthur a little bit younger than Mark. He just has a lot of great stories that cover Atlanta, Athens, Boston. He can talk about Laura Carter all day. He'd be a great interview if you need one. So.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure Come is going to come up at some point. So
yeah,
our goal is to get to every band at least once.
Good.
That put out a record in the 90s.
Well, this is great. I'm going to take off, but it was so much fun. Mark, great to talk to you too.
You
Bye.
too, Grace. Thank you,
Bye,
guys.
Grace.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
All right.
Let me know when this is going to air, or when
Tuesday.
It's up, or...
I will. I'll shoot you an email.
Oh, great. And have fun editing all that.
Thanks.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care, Mark.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm going to okay. So if you would like to suggest an album, go to digmeoutpodcast.com. That's where you can drop a suggestion in our suggest an album field. You can join us at Patreon for as little as $2 a month to support the podcast. Get to vote in our polls that we mentioned regarding various albums that are suggested. And if you join us at different levels, the higher you go, the more things you get access to, including at any level, you get the box newsletter where we review new releases from 80s and 90s relevant artists, books, movies, and of course, albums every week, delivered to your doorstep via email. And if you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback at Apple Podcasts. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.